What is the first thing that comes to mind when someone says Las Vegas? Elvis, gambling, mobsters. Maybe it's the ad line, what happens here stays here. Those are all modern associations. But what you might not know about this glittering city is its glowing past. Literally.
The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers.
This treaty is not the millennium. It will not resolve all conflicts or cause the communists to forego their ambitions or eliminate the dangers of war.
As late as 1951, the desert north of Las Vegas was a vast, barren landscape with very few people living there. The steadily growing community of Las Vegas was centered on a small number of hotels, cocktail lounges, and casinos. World War II had brought military aviation to the state in a big way, including a sprawling aerial gunnery and bombing range northwest of Las Vegas Army Airfield, now known as Nellis Air Force Base. But with the end of the war and the advent of the atomic bomb, many assumed that conventional warfare was a thing of the past. Silence once again descended over this vast land of harsh beauty, but not for long.
The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
The use of the atomic bomb to end World War II and the unfathomable damage it caused to Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, prompted scientific and military communities to more closely examine the power and effects of nuclear weapons. What were the effects of radiation on humans? How could these weapons be safely handled and transported from one place to another? Could ships, aircraft, tanks, submarines, and other equipment be fortified to withstand the blast effects and radiation of a nuclear detonation?
There was a desire to understand the effect of nuclear weapons on all aspects of warfare, including the machines of warfare, the ships of warfare, and a very practically driven desire to see what was the effect of an atomic bomb on a ship. Would it function? Would the engines die?
Well, after we dropped 2 bombs on Japan at the end of the war, we didn't have many left. We didn't know what we were going to do. The rest of the world didn't know that situation, but we knew it ourselves. So they began to do testing first in the South Pacific.
1 T0.
After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, officials became concerned about their lack of knowledge of the atomic bomb's after effects, particularly concerning naval targets and how they would fare in a nuclear attack. Due to the immense destructive powers that the United States now possessed, a commission assembled to look for a test site where they could find the answers to these questions. With approval from the White House, Crossroads was born. In 1946, Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands was chosen as a test site. The location was ideal because it was far away from population centers and had ample anchorage for both fleet and support ships.
Well, they chose to test in the Pacific because we had control of some of that area. And so they moved just a small population of islanders, the Bikini Islanders and the Marshall Islands, which were under trust to us, which is kind of ironic that they trusted us with it and then we blew it up.
Crossroads is the first set of post-World War II nuclear tests. So this is the first set of tests that are done not in the urgency of war and not in the name of war, but to see what is going to be the use of this new weapon into the future.
In 1947, the Cold War was beginning to warm up, and the Soviet Union was planning to add nuclear weaponry to its arsenal. Sure enough, in late 1949, they set off their first fission bomb. The U.S. was now being challenged by Russia for military power. So, in early 1950, President Harry S. Truman rubber-stamped the development of the hydrogen bomb, a far more destructive weapon than the atom bomb. This project was called Operation Greenhouse. Greenhouse was short-lived as the Korean conflict had begun, putting a large burden on the military and crippling further research.
It was kind of like the perfect storm. Korean War, cost, the Soviet Union's quick advancement toward thermonuclear capability, that they submitted the Nutmeg Report again.
And then after it became evident that the Russians had a bomb as well, they needed a place that was closer, cheaper, faster, and easier to secure, and that's when it came to Nevada.
The Project Nutmeg Report was a study to look at sites in the continental United States, including Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. Many of the suggested locations were ruled out for the potential danger to downwind populations. The commission finally decided on an area between Las Vegas and Tonopah, Nevada, because there were only 4,100 people who lived in possible harm's way, and the small population made it possible for hasty evacuation.
So there were a variety of examinations of different places going on, analysis of those natural environments and their suitability for testing, an analysis of the people who lived there and where they lived and what was the extent of the population.
They looked at 6 locations and finally settled on this location, which was a part of the Nellis bombing and gunnery range at the time. They carved out 640 square miles of it. The president signed the paperwork on December 18th, 1950, and on January 27th, 1951, 45 calendar days later, they dropped the first bomb on the United States.
I mean, it was an enormous cost to conduct these tests in the Pacific. I mean, moving material, manpower, just an enormous cost. And so it was essentially a cost-saving device. And the Nevada test site was ultimately chosen. It was kind of an exciting development. It was a time when people were much more naive.
As word about the search for a continental test site leaked out, and horror stories of the aftermath of Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings spread, concerns about safety grew into a daunting public relations situation. The Division of Military Application Director James McCormick reported that while no site within the continental U.S. could be considered a completely satisfactory alternative to the Marshall Islands, the Nevada location most nearly satisfies all of the established criteria. President Truman approved the choice and the operation was underway. The location was primarily chosen for its rugged and inhospitable terrain, where only a handful of people had ever lived. A small group of Paiute Indians inhabited the area for a short while, and in 1849, Mormons camped there on their way to the California gold fields. A few other groups lived there through the years, but all quickly evacuated the area as it was considered unfit for settling.
I can only imagine what it was like to be out here living in these conditions, long distances between where some of the springs were for the water, doing those type of things.
Scarcity of game forced the Native American population to subsist primarily on seeds and other vegetable foods. By the early 20th century, most free-roaming Native Americans had moved to surrounding towns or relocated to reservations. It had been nearly 100 years since the 49ers rumbled through on their way to Death Valley. Since then, the area has been uninhabited, except for the occasional prospector and a shepherd or two. This area would become the Nevada test site. In 1940, however, the precise characteristics that had made the region so unattractive, the desolation and lack of water, brought it to the attention of the federal government. With war looming, the United States had begun a major rearmament program. Part of this program involved locating bombing and gunnery training ranges for the Army Air Corps. In late 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the Las Vegas Bombing and Gunnery Range, which encompassed more than 3.5 million acres north and west of Las Vegas. The range stretched almost to Tonopah and included all of what would later become the test site. The majority of the range was in the public domain, but a number of grazing, homestead, and mining claims made it difficult to take possession. However, in late 1941, the government began condemnation proceedings against the outstanding parcels of land.
It was government-owned land, very low population, weather conditions were good. Normally the wind conditions were going toward the north, which were very few people up in that desert area. And they felt that they can control what days they shot on based on weather conditions.
The Nevada test site would encompass 1,375 square miles of endless barren desert wasteland. The uninhabited land would soon become populated by a landslide of scientists, physicists, and government workers who settled in the tiny town of Mercury, which, by its immediate population boom, became the third largest city in Nevada.
During my tenure with the Atomic Energy Commission and later the Department of Energy, when we were the third largest economic piece in the state of Nevada. This was a city of 10 to 12,000 people.
There was a large mess hall. There was a steakhouse, as I recall. There were movie theaters. There was a bowling alley. So for some people, they actually lived out there from Monday through Friday. And occasionally when I was working a double shift, I too would stay out there in a temporary base.
The site debuted its first surface test on the morning of January 27, 1951. It was called Able. Subsequent bomb testing became a main event in Las Vegas as the residents and visitors lined up to watch the show. Observers could actually see mushroom clouds over the neon signs of the Frontier and Golden Nugget hotels. People were coming to Las Vegas just to see the blasts. After the first atomic test in 1945, public excitement over the new phenomenon crept into everyday life, from pop culture to commerce to civic dealings. Songs and movies were written about the bomb, and businesses nationwide, from motels to cafes, adopted the atomic name.
Well, that's another interesting aspect of it. It was not only here in Nevada, but nationally. The whole topic of the atom bomb was very sexy. It was the latest thing. It was hot, hot, hot. At one time, you found in the phone book many, many companies, from telephone companies to rug companies to furniture companies, all used the name Atomic. And then it became part of the film industry with the science fiction films. Songs, Atomic Bomb Baby, adopted that theme.
For those who were witnessing, either from Las Vegas as part of some tourist activity, local residents who could see the blasts or the flash of the blasts from Las Vegas, or who were making the trip up to Mount Charleston purposefully to really get a better look at the blast, there was an atmosphere of extreme interest. These were the most famous spectacles on Earth. So it's not surprising that if these are happening anywhere near you, everybody would be interested in this. It was fascinating.
Though a fascination with the atomic bomb pervaded cities across the United States, its influence was most prominent in southern Nevada. A hairstylist at the Flamingo Hotel created the atomic hairdo for special occasions. And bartenders on the Las Vegas Strip commonly served the atomic cocktail.
Hi, my name is Rose, and I'm the general manager of Atomic Liquors, and this is where the scientists would come after their nuclear testing experiments. So here is the atomic cocktail. It is 1 part vodka, 1 part brandy, 1 part sherry, and it's topped with champagne with a lemon swath garnish. And voila, here you have it, the atomic cocktail.
Lounge singers and comedians tailored their show names and routines to the atomic obsession. And the Sands Hotel even held a Miss Atomic Bomb beauty pageant, where contestants dressed up in bathing suits resembling fluffy white mushroom clouds. A famous photo shows the pageant winner posing in the desert, smiling wide with arms raised and toes pointed. Even business owners capitalized on the trend. Car, furniture, and clothing salesmen used the atomic name to promote sales. Casinos informed their guests of upcoming shots, provided maps to viewing areas, and even sold bag lunches to take to nearby Mount Charleston to watch a test. The popular atomic image was a diversion from an unsavory truth that Americans didn't know much about the bomb and its serious consequences.
Turn in 5 seconds.
Due to the ideal weather conditions and minimal radiation levels, a second detonation was set off 24 hours later. It was called Baker. At 8 kilotons, Baker was bigger than the first and awoke the entire town. People in the casinos saw what looked like chain lightning, and buildings were rattled by 2 or 3 shocks.
Las Vegans could have been scared to death by these nuclear tests. They could have, come out in protest. They could have run away. But Las Vegas, very pragmatic as always, decided to make the most of it. And instead of being afraid of the tests, they turned them into a tourist attraction. And we had people staying up all night and in the top floor lounges and restaurants of the casinos so that they could witness the tests firsthand and feel the rumble in the hotel when the test went off.
The Atomic Energy Commission, created in 1946 to control all sources of atomic energy, suffered its first setback as some radioactive debris was caught up in high-altitude winds blowing eastward. There were reports of radioactive snow falling in the Midwestern and northeastern U.S. This was merely the start of a public relations problem that was destined to grow larger.
They had some snowfall as a result of rain conditions with some minor fallout as far as the state of New York. Again, very low level, but there was some, as you mentioned, throughout the United States, a minor amount of fallout, rain conditions, snow conditions.
We've all seen on the news these fast-moving thunderstorms that cross the globe, or cross the United States, continental United States, in quite a hurry. It will be these that cause fallout in Troy, New York, cause fallout in Kansas. There's no state in the continental United States that didn't receive fallout as a result of atmospheric testing in Nevada.
2 more shots, Easy and Baker 2, were set off. The results were uneventful, except for a couple of broken windows in downtown Las Vegas. The final shot was to be considerably larger, and officials were somewhat concerned about any damage that might go beyond a few broken windows. The show must go on, and it did. The next detonation was greater than all that preceded it. People at the observation benches 8 miles away felt a flash of heat at the time of the explosion.
I can only imagine what it was. It's 8 miles or so as the crow flies across the desert here to where the blasts were set off. And to be here on those mornings, I can only imagine what it was like. The first thing that they would have felt when they would have seen that mushroom cloud grow out of the desert would have been the heat coming towards them.
After the blast, a huge dust cloud filled the valley, limiting vision to about 100 yards. Minor damage was reported, including a few shattered windows at a couple of car dealerships. Several gamblers leapt under tables in response to the blast. Las Vegas quickly became a destination for reporters as a multitude descended on the town to write about the latest news sensation.
People would come to Las Vegas when they knew these tests were happening. They were a very poorly kept secret as to when they were happening, and people would come specifically to be in Las Vegas during the tests.
The entire city was, along with the visitors, completely caught up in this massive pyrotechnic review. Las Vegas was having the biggest growth of tourism in its brief history. People were setting their alarms early in the morning to be sure and not miss the spectacle. Even Los Angeles was feeling the effects of the blasts as windows and doors were rattled. The event turned into a reporter's holiday. In a span of 10 days, 5 tests from Operation Ranger were conducted at the Nevada test site. And then, as suddenly as it started, it was over.
Whatever you do, wherever you may go, you are a part of atomic warfare.
A new, more flexible approach to nuclear testing was established by the Greenhouse and Ranger series. The two were different in the respect that Greenhouse was far more costly than Ranger. It was decided that the higher yield weapons would continue to be shot off in the Pacific, while weapons up to 60 kilotons could now be tested in Nevada, saving a great deal of money in comparison to the Pacific operations. The Nevada test site was now considered permanent, a state-of-the-art proving ground for nuclear weapons.
When the command raise has been given, stand up and lean against the rear of your foxhole.
In July 1951, the Military Liaison Committee requested the availability of 5,000 combat troops and 3,500 observers. The Army wanted troops to experience a simulated combat experience in the wake of nuclear explosions and to measure the physical and psychological toll on the soldiers. For safety reasons, the troops were not allowed any closer than 7 miles from ground zero. They were allowed to dig in order to get a little closer, but they were told to leave their gear behind when the shot was scheduled to detonate.
This is the last in a series of trenches that soldiers would be in that extend out in this direction. And what the Department of Defense was doing was having the soldiers march towards ground zero after a test went off to understand the psychological effects on a soldier if he were in a nuclear blast.
During Buster Jangle, it was proposed by the powers that be that non-voluntary participation by dogs, sheep, and rats was to be used to determine the extent of thermal burns and other adverse effects. Carol Tyler, AEC's test commander for the series, expressed strong reservations due to a possible public backlash.
Well, it was pretty brutal. During some of the effects tests, they used animals. They used goats and sheep.
By the time you have testing at the Nevada test site, you have both a national security imperative that testing needs to be done and a real fear that the Soviets might attack with a weapon. And so all that you can find out without using humans, and that means you use animals.
Safety could not be fully guaranteed. Concerns about optical damage, radiation exposure, blindness, thermal burns, sandblasting, and error in shot location were just a few of the questions brought up when the discussion of safety was on the table. The public was under the impression that the Nevada Proving Ground was safe, and one such incident could blow up into a PR nightmare.
As a youngster, I don't recall anybody suggesting, this could be dangerous. At the time, we were assured by, all of the agencies, I think it was the Atomic Energy Commission and perhaps others, that there was nothing to worry about. This was absolutely safe.
Public support waned both locally and nationally, and people began to question continental testing. Perceived safety was necessary for ongoing support from not only Las Vegas, but smaller surrounding towns as well. However, testing was still news. The last two buster shots at 21 and 31 kilotons were more spectacular. The Las Vegas Review-Journal described the November 1st shot as a late Halloween treat. It added that locals were still thrilled by rattling windows, the sounds of rushing air, and the beauty of a mushroom cloud that appears after an explosion.
It's more of a morbid fascination, being captivated by this incredible new source of power that is being unleashed, and that for everybody who saw it, there was simply no doubt that you were seeing something new to humanity.
After the buster shot, the media was up in arms, complaining that they had been withheld from observing the tests. Time magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and even the Minneapolis Tribune wrote critical articles about their supposed exclusion. The AEC was greatly troubled by the negative press, and as a gesture of goodwill, decided to allow reporters and reps from civil defense organizations view the next test, named Charlie. In April of 1952, the AEC, in a grand public relations offering, provided 4 buses for journalists departing from Las Vegas and arriving at the observation post. This arrangement was graciously accepted, and the articles once again turned favorable.
The destructive force of 15,000 tons of TNT, a mass of rubble. Yet, less than a mile from ground zero, a human being in a shelter should have survived.
Operation Doorstep was the Federal Civil Defense Administration's name for a program that tested the effects of nuclear blasts on structures. Unable to build skyscrapers or apartment buildings, they built a series of concrete walls open at the front and back so they could easily be studied.
Doomtowns were built on the test site to see what would be the impact of the bomb on just an average local community. So they built houses, they built stores, they even built a bank with a bank vault. So they built those and then they blew them up.
The structural experiments went exactly as expected. High-speed cameras recorded in slow motion as the house closest to ground zero collapsed, blown away like a pile of toothpicks. Mannequins acting as stand-ins for humans were destroyed, their remains pockmarked by flying glass. In a questionable decision, the mannequins were displayed in the window of a JCPenney store in downtown Las Vegas, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal ran a series of photos entitled, "These mannequins could have been real people. In fact, they could have been you."
Well, they learned positions of the mannequins, where to put them, where they would be safest in terms of, duck and cover. They put clothes on them to see what would be the impact there. Some were sitting at dining tables. They had small children ones with toys. It was all to see the impact on what an average American town would, how they would be affected.
In a later test, in order to evaluate service clothing's ability to prevent skin burns, the Army placed 55 shaved and anesthetized pigs dressed in Army uniforms at varying distance from the point of detonation. Pigs were chosen because their flesh is similar to that of a human's.
There was not the kind of reaction that there might have been today. People were thinking of these things in the context of the Cold War. It seemed like the fate of freedom was at stake, and the fate of some pigs not so important.
The concern over pig testing faded as radioactive fallout became the chief concern after Upshot Knothole. Fallout hadn't been an issue in most detonations, but numerous complaints followed the Upshot Knothole series, with critics questioning whether the test site should even exist. The 7th shot in the upshot knothole operation was named Simon. Its path moved eastward in great intensity. Major highways 91 and 93 were hit with intense levels of fallout, and due to the contamination of many cars, state police set up a roadblock. After checking over 400 vehicles, 50 of these were given complimentary car washes. The director of the Division of Biology and Medicine, John C. Buger, told a commission that in some thinly populated areas, the dosage had been as high as 10 Roentgens. He added that the day after Simon, fallout had occurred near Troy, New York, and ranchers downwind were claiming livestock deaths due to the fallout.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my mom and dad says, "Eddie, come here, I want to show you something." And right there, that's Badger Mountain. On the computer, it might call it Tickaboo Peak. But to the left of that, there was a big, dark cloud raise up right out through there and then drift to the north. And that's the only atmospheric test that I remember.
I know a lot of the horses had spots on them from burns. Once in a while, the deer you'd see with spots on it from the burn, from the bomb. And I know they said that around the reservoir over there where the horses were watered, you get a handful of that mud and it was hot. And that was along the reservoir.
In mid-1953, the most fallout-intensive continental atmospheric test was detonated. There were two ways to describe this particular nuclear bomb. Until then, it was the most destructive pure fission weapon designed, weighing in at 32 kilotons. Also, as a result of changing wind condition and direction, this test generated more radioactive fallout than any other U.S. test. Due to this unexpected situation, the test was given the unfortunate nickname Dirty Harry.
There was a series of 11 tests done in 1953 at the site, one of which I know a lot of people are concerned with, which was the Simon test and Harry. Both of them had significant fallout off the test site.
People in St. George, some of the sheep ranchers in that area were exposed to that radioactive fallout. Now, they were warned, and they were very patriotic, and they were very trusting. They believed that they would be kept safe.
The discovery of dead sheep became the next big hurdle. Utah officials were reporting that an unusual number of ewes and infant lambs were found dead. Fallout was being blamed for this latest disaster, as many of the sheep were determined to have beta burns in their nostrils and on their backs. It is common to have a few deaths among the flock in springtime, but the losses were totaling in the thousands. As one would imagine, this public grew concerned. The AEC, in an effort to preserve support for the test site, decided to present the entire story to the public, holding back nothing. This served only as a band-aid, as people in the vicinity were rapidly losing faith in the AEC. In August 1953, the world got the news that Russia had developed a hydrogen bomb. This was confirmed by the U.S. Air Force Long-Range Detection System. The arms race was very much alive and kicking.
Because the Soviets were headed in that direction quicker than people had thought. And they had to have some very important tests done prior to the Castle series out in the Pacific.
The U.S. responded to the Soviets' latest endeavor by commencing the Castle series in the spring of 1954 in the Pacific. The first shot was called Bravo and was the U.S.'s third hydrogen bomb test. The detonation did have some serious drawbacks, as members of a nearby fishing crew were reported to have unexpectedly high levels of radiation.
Castle Bravo was a very frightening test, and it was even frightening for the AEC because the yield ended up being larger than they'd expected. The fallout from the Castle Bravo test extended beyond the closed area of the Pacific.
Castle Bravo is important in the escalation of global concern and protest over nuclear testing, regardless of where it was happening, because everything at Castle Bravo is happening on a scale that is exponentially larger, because these are hydrogen bombs.
Studies indicated that the crew of the Japanese fishing boat Lucky Dragon had been exposed to external gamma radiation ranging from 130 to 450 roentgens, which in common verbiage is a potentially deadly amount. The incident became a major issue in Japanese politics and in Japanese-American relations. The Japanese politicos took great exception to what they referred to as total negligence. The Lucky Dragon incident, coupled with health damage to Marshallese Islanders and sheep deaths, sparked international disapproval that would eventually culminate in an atmospheric test ban treaty. This reaction stunted the plans of the AEC, even threatening their future. Despite bad press and growing public fear, testing in Nevada still forged ahead. By 1954, Mercury's housing facilities had some 2,000 workers living under their roof, not counting many more who lived in Las Vegas, some 65 miles away, and commuted daily.
As you entered into Mercury, you had a housing office. That's where I worked in later years after I got out of the military in 1960. Everybody who entered the test site was badged. And the badge had various punches which would say, look, you're eligible to go to this area, but not this area.
The testing continued. Operation Teapot would consist of 12 tests. This time, however, an early announcement of Teapot in late 1954 warned public officials, stockmen, miners, and others in southern Nevada and elsewhere.
Word has just been received from the Atomic Energy Commission that due to a change in wind direction, the residue from this morning's atomic detonation is drifting in the direction of St. George. It is suggested that everyone remain indoors for 1 hour or until further notice. There is no danger.
As a further attempt at education for the public, and also much needed positive spin, AEC produced a motion picture called Atomic Tests in Nevada, which focused mainly on fallout and safeguards.
Since the rest of the town was sound asleep, only our night owl saw it, that great flash in the western sky. An atomic bomb at the Nevada test site 140 miles to the west.
The film premiered in St. George, Utah in early 1955. It presented several safety suggestions and advised residents to stay inside after a shot.
There was a real PR effort. That was part of the AEC under Strauss, who was the director, who thought we needed a PR effort. And they did it in a number of ways. One, they did it through the civil defense films, which reassured people that they could be safe.
To further study the effects of the tests on simple everyday living conditions, the FCDA went all out in preparation for Operation Q. A small town of 8 houses and 6 industrial buildings were constructed 4,700 feet from ground zero. The press, in an attempt at cleverness, had dubbed this small establishment with such names as Terror Town, Doom Town, and Survival City. The FCDA built 4 additional houses that added to this growing guinea pig metropolis. The structures were filled with 70 mannequins that were to represent various families of men, women, children, and infants, all placed in realistic poses. 15 tons of food were exposed to the blasts and later fed to dogs, monkeys, and a long list of volunteers, including 9 Mennonite conscientious objectors. Now, an unforeseen problem was budding. All the military and civil defense workers would quickly migrate to Las Vegas, and to make the congestion even more critical and put the city officials in a frenzy, Las Vegas was hosting a major prize fight and also the Tournament of Champions Golf Classic, which both would attract thousands of tourists. For the first time in its history, tourists were discouraged from visiting the Golden City of Lost Wages.
Actually, they were telling people, don't come to Las Vegas, we're too crowded, there's no rooms for you between the golf and the normal tourism, and then this open activity at the Nevada test site. So it was quite a day and quite a time.
On the morning of the scheduled test, a multitude of observers huddled at the test site. Unfortunately for the amassed faithful, the 5:15 shot was canceled at 4:45, and the disappointed crowd milled its way back to their cars. The press, however, took a different light on the cancellation, with the Las Vegas Review-Journal running the headline, "Vegans Miss Bath of Radiation." The paper noted that winds would have covered the Las Vegas Valley in a blanket of atomic radiation.
But the shot kept being delayed because of weather, kept being delayed. So a lot of these people ran out of money. They had to leave town. And as a result, there wasn't as many people when the actual shot went off.
Observers without goggles must face away from the blast.
However, those who stuck around were greatly rewarded. Apple II was fired on the 5th of May, 1955, with Doomtown being hit with significant destruction. The result of the test, as it affected Doomtown, was reported with mixed reviews. 2 of the houses were leveled, 1 brick and the other wood, and 2 of the industrial structures were also severely beat up. The headlines of numerous publications were varied. As one would say, Survivaltown buildings stand up well in test, while another would report death and destruction in atom-blasted town.
This is what many people like to refer to as Doomtown, and this is one of the last few remaining houses from that. It's called the Apple II houses from the Apple II test, which was conducted in 1955.
With the combination of radioactive fallout and the growing outcry for a nuclear test ban for health and political reasons, a testing moratorium was put into effect in 1958.
There were people coming from all over the world to participate in these tests. It was generating money for the economy. It was one of the primary economic drivers of the economy of Las Vegas, the state of Nevada. So the consequences of a moratorium on testing created a lot of uncertainty.
When the moratorium was enacted, the AEC argued that the reason they should continue their research was that this was a Cold War, and the arms race against the Soviet Union was alive and well. It was added that the Soviets were vigorously campaigning for a total moratorium for obvious reasons. They wanted to stop the U.S. from all further testing while they continued to develop their own nuclear stockpile, passing the U.S. and succeeding in their quest for eventual world domination. It was a fact that at the present time, the U.S. maintained an edge in the arms race, but if a moratorium continued, the Soviets would easily pass the U.S. through espionage, research and development, and constant clandestine testing. On October 4th, 1957, the Russians launched the first satellite in space, Sputnik 1. This Cold War maneuver shocked the American people. Not only was the Soviet Union ahead in the space race, but they were apparently ahead in developing ballistic missile technology which could carry a thermonuclear warhead to Europe or the U.S. The most ambitious testing to date, Operation Plumb Bob, was held at the Nevada test site. The plan was to set off numerous shots. Among them were the proof firing of air defense and anti-submarine warheads that had been scheduled for production. Part of the testing would be made on 4 surface-to-air missiles and an atomic depth charge. The newest endeavor for Plumb Bob was deep underground testing. There was great anticipation for the success of this venture, as underground shots would produce no fallout, while providing useful information for possible applications for atomic weapons.
There was a sense of urgency during Plumb Bob, scientific urgency, military urgency, and there were a lot of firsts in Plumb Bob, different types of tests, balloons, and different efforts to try and control fallout. And most importantly, the first major fully contained underground nuclear test in Rainier.
One of the hard things that's happening in the mid-1950s is that, especially after the Lucky Dragon incident, the global cry to cease testing is getting stronger and stronger.
The ever-continuing debate over fallout continued for over 3 years. Locals became fearful of health repercussions.
We were, because the cloud went over us. It didn't go to, I don't think it went to Vegas. And I know a lot of the people wore those tags where they checked them quite a bit. Some of them had a ticking noise, some of them didn't.
Nuclear testing was popular among the Nevada politicians as they realized the role that it played in the growth of the state and the prosperity that it generated. Governor Charles Russell, along with the other politicians, fully supported the activities at the test site. In 1952, he declared the test site a boom for the entire state.
In fact, Nevada welcomed the test site. There was a time when Governor Russell said, oh, it's great, now the desert is blooming with atoms.
The concern about fallout and the rising levels of radioactivity had become a worldwide debate and made atmospheric testing increasingly moot. So by 1956, the testing community considered alternative ways that would contain the radioactive fallout and eliminate its passage into the atmosphere. Hence, deep underground testing was considered and proved to be the answer to this entire puzzle, but not entirely.
Scientists and military leaders who even disagreed with the dangers of atmospheric testing understood that a new method was going to be required.
Alvin Graves, testing chief at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, had made up his mind that any following tests were to be done entirely underground. Underground testing was set up using a horizontal tunnel which replaced the former vertical one. This passageway was believed to provide more of an easy access to Ground Zero, facilitate diagnostics, and most important of all, fully contain radioactive debris. One of these underground tests, however, had bombed. Literally. On December 18, 1970, codenamed Bainbury, which was a 10-kiloton nuclear device set off 910 feet underneath Yucca Flat on the northern border of the site. A plug that was sealing the test shaft from the surface failed, allowing a large quantity of radioactive debris into the atmosphere. This waste reached a height of 10,000 feet, exposing at least 86 people who worked at the site to radioactivity.
Looking out a plate glass window to the west, and he walked back into the front office, which was on the opposite end of the building, and he said, "The testing program has just ended." And we said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Bainbury has vented."
I was at the control point on December 18th, 1970, for what we thought would be just a normal test. We saw this cloud vapor type thing rising up to 10,000 feet. Fortunately, that day the wind was just absolutely still, and for a long time that cloud just stood there.
Even with the precautions taken, some radioactivity escaped into the atmosphere. On October 30th, 1958, the underground nuclear test, codenamed Blanca, was described by an observer as venting out the entire face of the mesa. The city of Los Angeles panicked. When the fallout arrived, it pushed the Southern California city's radiation level higher than usual. The AEC commissioner assured Norris Paulson, the then mayor of Los Angeles, that the tests were safe. However, when Paulson discovered that AEC planned another shot in the same month, his assistants observed that he literally went into orbit. It had all come to an end by then, as the 1958 nuclear testing moratorium was now in place. The Soviet Union was once again in the middle of a controversy, demanding veto power over any proposed inspection. As a result, the Geneva test ban talks collapsed in January of 1962, and nuclear testing resumed. However, Khrushchev, apparently more amenable after the Cuban Missile Crisis humiliation, agreed to direct talks on the test ban in Moscow. On July 2nd, the Soviet premier proposed a treaty that would ban tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. As a result, in July of 1963, New York politician Averell Harriman initiated the Limited Test Ban Treaty for the United States. Because this treaty allowed the U.S. to do so, from August 1963 to September 1992, more than 700 tests were conducted at the Nevada test site. One of the darkest days of our country's history took place on September 11, 2001, as a group of terrorists attacked the cities of New York and Washington, D.C., flying planes into the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon, causing 3,000 deaths. This sparked an intense effort to combat terrorism. Since then, the Nevada test site has changed its name to the Nevada National Security Site and plays an integral role in the United States' effort to stop terrorism.
Everything we do out here at the site is related to national security. And this is just one of those sites. And this is where first responders from across the United States come and train and learn how to use radiation detection equipment. After 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security gave all of these fire departments, police departments, radiation detection equipment, and they didn't know how to use it.
On September 23, 1992, a test named Divider was detonated, which was the last underground test to be done. Immediately afterward, Congress imposed a ban on nuclear testing, and after worldwide negotiations, a comprehensive test ban treaty was created. The U.S. signed it, and even today, it remains in effect. Was all of this testing critical to the survival and protection of our country?
I feel it was, yes. I don't see where we could have done without it. And we should have done more of it.
The scientists knew more than the general public, and it really wasn't as safe as they were telling us, but this was a critical part of our national defense effort.
Well, there's certainly no question that it contributed to the end of the Cold War, and the people who worked there felt very strongly about that. Did they do some things wrong? No question, and the healthcare priorities should have been higher, but I won't argue that it certainly made a contribution.
Was the arms race with Russia productive in preventing an all-out nuclear war? We may never know. Anytime a country develops a weapon so potentially catastrophic, capable of killing and destroying the world many times over, it should be given the test.